Jim Allan to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. I want to ask a direct question first, given your Canadian heritage. Why should Canada exist as an independent, separate nation?
Well, it's why any country exists. It's partly historical. People forget that when the American Revolution, I always forget whether the Americans call it the War of Independence or the Brits call it that, and the other ones call it the Revolutionary War. But when the American colonies rose up, about a third of the colony population was for the revolution, about a third was against, and the other third just sat there to see what would happen. And obviously the Brits were occupied in Europe with the French. And if you go back to the 1750s, 60s, there's about a 7-year period where the Brits take out the French in India, in North America, in the Caribbean. The only reason that English is the world language is basically those 7 years. And people forget that George Washington was in the British colonial army, not colonial in the American sense, but he fought for the British. Because there would never have been an uprising if the French were still in North America. All the English colonists were petrified of France. And so when the English took out the French, that freed things up. And the other thing is, if you read the Niall Ferguson book, they said no taxation without representation. But of course, the colonists in Massachusetts were the least taxed people in the British Empire. And they had a really good deal. So it was a sort of upper middle class merchants uprising. And at any time other than the British having to deal with the French, the British would have crushed it in about 2 seconds. They had incredibly incompetent leaders like Cornwallis. But even when the Americans won, about a third of the colonists were loyalists. And I actually have some relatives who are called United Empire loyalists. They left the US, stayed loyal to Britain, and went up to Canada, which at that point was basically French, except for a little bit out in Nova Scotia. And so a lot of the people in Ontario actually came up. And, Benjamin Franklin's son was a United Empire loyalist. Benjamin Franklin and his son basically never spoke again. It's a really sad story after the War of Independence because his son was a loyalist. And so the reason Canada really started as distinct from the US is that, the French didn't want to revolt. I think all the American colonists thought the French in Quebec would revolt. They didn't want to because they had a pretty good deal from the Brits. And then the loyalists, the ones who stayed loyal to the crown, went up to Canada. So historically, they'd always been suspicious of the Americans. The War of 1812 was started by the Americans. That was when President Madison was president. Madison is one of the great geniuses in history. He drafted the U.S. Constitution. Not quite single-handedly, but almost. But he was a terrible president. And the northern, this is 1812, the northern Massachusetts people, they wouldn't fight. So the War of 1812 was really Virginia soldiers up against the Brits. And the Brits basically, with Canadian, it was basically a tie, which when I grew up in Canada, we learned that was a win because we didn't start it. And the White House today is called the White House because the Brits came into Washington, D.C. and they burned it to the ground. And when they repainted it, they painted it white.
I guess what I'm getting at is today with Trump making these pronouncements about saying how great Canada would be if it was annexed as part of the US, what's the response? I know that's triggered a bit of Canadian sort of national feeling, but what's the argument? Why fundamentally should Canada be a distinctive, separate nation from the Americans?
I'd say two things to preface my answer. Firstly, Trump's not serious. The last thing that Donald Trump wants is 38 million Canadians who are to the left of California. The Republicans would never win another election if Canada became the fifth. Come on, they'd have a lot of electoral college votes and they would all go left. The second thing I would say is that if you go back before Trudeau, so 2015, the richest Canadian provinces were somewhere in the middle, right? So Ontario and Alberta, quite wealthy provinces, they wouldn't have been in the top 10 US states in terms of wealth, but they were up there. I think it's true that there's not a single Canadian province now that's as wealthy as the poorest US state. Maybe that's wrong, but certainly they come in at 48, 49. So 10 years of Trudeau have impoverished Canada. The net zero religion has impoverished them. they have made themselves, ironically, completely vulnerable to the U.S. because Trudeau blocked all the pipelines to the sea. So the only place the oil can go is to the U.S. And Canada actually sells its oil and gas at a discount to the U.S. because the Americans know they have nowhere else to send it. So the very same sort of left-wing crazies who trying to whip up Canadian nationalism made Canada incredible. It's a bit like Merkel in Russia.
Trudeau famously talked about Canada being the first post-national state. And so my interpretation of the Trump stuff, it's almost a bit of tough love to try and get the Canadians to say, no, you actually are a real nation, like, and if you're not a real nation, well, we might as well take you over. But if you are a real nation, so start thinking like one rather than being this,
Well, I think Trump's been elected by Americans, and his job is to help Americans. If he can, and in some ancillary way, help allies, great. But that's not his job, and I don't think he really cares that much. I think he, on a personal level, detests Justin Trudeau, who called him, racist, white nationalist. The same way that the British Foreign Minister Lammy called him a threat. So I can't. I mean, the insults were myriad. And it was very disappointing this morning to read that Peter Dutton said if he wins, he'll keep Kevin Rudd in as ambassador. I mean, I really don't understand who advises Peter Dutton. It's right now, it's becoming pathetic. He's sold out on free speech. I mean, I still want him to win because Albanese's so awful, but they don't seem to understand that unless you make promises in advance, and you don't have a mandate when you get into office. And one of the great things Trump did is he said, I'm going to do the following 20 things that everyone said, you can't do that. And when he won, he's just ticking them off one after another. And if anyone objects, he said, I told you, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah. Look, it is amazing. And I don't know, I've read your Spectator articles over the year and how dissatisfied you are have been with multiple Liberal Party leaders on different fronts. There is an election in Canada coming up, though. Let's talk about that first, and we'll come back to the problems in Australia. And I always find Canadian politics a little bit hard to wrap my head around because there are, you've got the Quebecois bloc, and you've got New Party, and you've got different areas which vote very different ways. What would you say someone seeking to better understand Canadian politics in the lead up to the next national election up there should understand about the different dynamics at play?
So the first thing you need to know is that the median voter in Canada would be a standard deviation or more to the political left of the median voter in Australia. So Canada is very left-wing. They have first past the post. If they had preferential voting, I don't know that a conservative would ever win. And so you have two left-wing parties. You have the Liberal Party, which is really left, and then you have this party that originally started with the unions, but now really the link with the unions is pretty weak. But that's called the NDP, the New Democratic Party. And Trudeau won a majority in his first election, and then he's had only minority government since. And the term of office in Canada is 5 years, so not 3. And the last this whole term, Trudeau's been in a coalition with the NDP. If the NDP had brought down Trudeau last year, the Liberals would have been obliterated. And the NDP would have been the opposition, and the NDP leader is incompetent. So before Trump came in on January 21st, Pierre Poilievre, who's a really good Conservative Party leader, he was up about 25 points in the polls. Never in my life have I seen anything like it. Since Trump has brought the tariffs in and since Trudeau stepped down, there are actually some polls that show a Carney-led Liberal Party is close. They're about equal with Poilievre. I don't believe that. If you go back in Canadian history, there's been twice with really, really unpopular leaders. The first Pierre Trudeau got forced out and they brought in a guy named John Turner. And for about a month, he went way up in the polls, Turner. And then when the election was called, he was crushed. And even worse, the Conservative Brian Mulroney, when he stepped down, he was incredibly unpopular. And they brought in a woman named Kim Campbell. And for at least a month, she was actually ahead of the Liberals. And when the election actually came, the Conservatives went from a majority in the House of Commons, I think it was like 168 out of 250 or something, to 2 seats. Because first past, they actually ended up with 2 seats. That's what first past the post can do. So I am pretty confident that the Liberal Party, the Canadian Liberal Party, the Justin Trudeau Party, even when they put in this former sort of Davos globalist banker Mark Carney, who tried to block Brexit when he was head of the Bank of England, and who has agreed with Trudeau on everything and is a net zero zealot. When he comes in and tries to distance himself from Trudeau, even though he was his advisor, I just don't think it's going to work. And I really think that Poilievre's going to win a big majority. So these polls that are showing Carney as almost equal to Poilievre, I mean, there's historical analogies where that happened. And then when the election actually came along, people went, well, we're not voting for these people. We hate them. So I'm not too worried about that. In terms of Canadian voting, firstly, ironically, Canada does not have the norm that you see in the US and Australia, where all electorates are the same number of voters. So, some constituencies in Quebec have fewer voters than out in Alberta. You also need to know that the Canadian upper house is appointed, so it doesn't really do anything. When you win a majority in Canada, you basically do what you want. You don't have to bargain with somebody who's got a lot of friends in Tasmania. Why you have to deal with an independent in Tasmania, remembering that your vote for the Senate in Tasmania is worth about 10 times more than a person's vote in New South Wales. And so Quebec always sits on the side. They vote for separatists sometimes. The whole of the east of Canada that we call the Maritimes is impoverished by Canadian standards. So you can think of them basically, and I don't want to insult people from there, but there's a large group of people in the Maritimes who live off welfare. And so they tend to vote for the Liberals, but then every once in a while, when it looks like the Liberals are going to lose, they switch to the Tories. And so the real battle is Ontario, Quebec, but Ontario West. Alberta, which is the big oil producing province, and in Canada, the provinces set their own income tax for their provincial matters, like every federal system in the world except here. You have I think it's almost zero provincial income tax. You just pay federal tax. And Saskatchewan are very conservative. I think in the last two elections, the Conservatives have won every seat in both provinces, or every seat but two. So they are. And so one of the problems is the Conservatives can win much more of the popular vote than the Liberals and lose the election because all of their votes are in one place. So they win these constituencies massively. And the other thing is that Toronto, Montreal, and British Columbia, which are the three big cities, they vote left. Inner city, Chardonnay sipping sentiments. And so the Conservatives in Canada have learned what Trump knows, which is that rich people by and large vote left. And that's true in Australia. People have this image that rich people vote conservative, which was true 60 years ago. But, Hillary Clinton in 2016, she won the 100 wealthiest counties. And Boris didn't get any of the rich London constituencies. So why we worry about the Teals here is beyond me. Rich people who have the money don't care that net zero is impoverishing everyone. And, we seem in this country to think we need to sort of fine tune our policies on the right to cater for a few incredibly wealthy inner city types who might, if their superannuation is threatened, vote conservative. I don't care about those people. I don't share very many values with them. And, Poilievre has figured this out. And so he doesn't worry about those seats. And that's why he was up 26, 27 points. Ironically, Trump has undermined him to some extent because there's been this sort of burst of nationalism. And the question is, who can best stand up to Trump? Well, the answer is probably Poilievre. But the lefties are trying to sell themselves as, we'll go to the wall against Trump. Of course, the U.S. would crush Canada. I don't know. Canada has one of the most lopsided trade arrangements. 75%, 78% of Canadian exports go to the U.S.
Yeah, right.
And Canada is the U.S.'s biggest trading partner, but it's something like 16%. So you're not going to win a trade war with the U.S. and all these sort of supposedly brave people in Canada going, we'll impoverish ourselves. They just couldn't win a trade war. I don't think Trump wants to have a trade war. I think what he wants to do is get Canada to spend a lot more on defense. And again, Canada spends, I think, 1%, even less than Australia. They just free ride. Rich inner city Canadians know that their defense is being paid for by poor Arkansas voters, which is the same, criticism of NATO. Over 70% of the NATO budget is paid for by American taxpayers. There's not a single country in the EU or include Britain that can defend themselves anymore. And when Trump makes this point, they they don't respond by saying, okay, well, we're going to start spending on defense. So when somebody like Starmer or Macron says we got to be really tough with Russia, what they mean is we'll sit here and we want Americans to be really tough with Russia. I kind of like what Trump's doing. It's time to cut a deal with Russia and end the war in Ukraine, I think. I don't want to start World War III. I'm not in World War III, and I don't know what the outcome is other than a peace deal.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Look, not to dwell on Canadian politics a little bit long, but I am quite interesting for the lessons it holds for Australia. And one of the things about Canada is they have, the leading centre-right party is the Conservative Party, and the opposition is the Liberal Party, which is obviously a bit confusing for Australians, where our centre-right party is the Liberal Party.
It used to be confusing, Dan, until the Liberal Party in Australia became as left-wing as so it's not as confusing anymore.
Right. But is there anything different, do you think? Because the Liberal Party in Australia, the grandees make a lot about the name. We're liberals, right? We're not conservatives. Do you think there's any substantive difference between the kind of rank and file, what the rank and file voter of the Conservative Party of Canada believes and the leaders, and the rank and file Liberal Party member and the leaders sort of believe? They're just different names for a similar type of centre-right party.
The reason for the name difference is they both started out back and they had the sort of classical John Stuart Mill understanding of liberalism. And that is gone in North America. So if you say to American, I'm liberal, they take that to mean I'm a progressive. So liberal in North America now means I'm a progressive left-wing sort of set of attitudes. That came about slowly over time, but the sort of old-fashioned, and by old-fashioned I mean 19th century John Stuart Mill, classical liberal, small government, lots of scope for people to make their own decisions. I mean, the Liberal Party doesn't even believe in free speech in North America. The progressives want to limit speech. They're all in on misinformation laws. To some extent, the name Liberal in Australia has kept a bit, at least up to John Howard, and it's even dubious with Howard, but it's kept that link to the 19th century better. And when Menzies picked the name, or whoever it was that got the name when Menzies, restarted the center right, I think they were looking at that. But the reason there's a closer link in Canada between the leader and the party base is quite simple. Canada has moved quite a while ago now to a system where, and this is true at the provincial level, and this is true, I think, of all parties, but certainly of the Conservative Party, that the party room does not pick the leader. And it's not a British sort of half-assed system where the party room gets it down to 2 and they manipulate it, and then the party base picks. In Canada, you join the Conservative Party, and after a year, you get the same vote as a cabinet minister. So the party base picks the leader, and the party room, the caucus, cannot remove him, only the party base. So the Conservatives in Canada party has about 750,000 members. Now, Canada's got about 50% more population than here. The Liberal Party in Australia has something like 20,000 party members, maybe fewer. So I'll say that again, 750,000, 20,000. If Canada, based on population, if the Conservative Party in Canada had the same number, that would be 30,000. It would be 50% bigger. And the reason so many people join is because their views matter. And if Poilievre would never, ever, ever have been chosen by the party room, because the party room always has these wet, moderate, lefty sort of MPs. And they are just sidelined in Canada because Poilievre comes in, he sets the policy framework, and they can't do anything about it. And they can't roll him. Turnbull would never have rolled Abbott with the Canadian system because the party base would never have voted for Malcolm Turnbull ever. And so Poilievre has this freedom. He comes in, and it's a bit like Trump. He can say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cut the funding of the CBC in half, which he has said. Now, can you imagine any Liberal Party leader actually having the cojones to take on the ABC? They should. It'll be very popular, but they won't do it.
Yeah. So Pierre Poilievre, how would you describe his governing philosophy? I mean, I've seen his YouTube clips, and he makes has some great pushback to journos that is unlike anything we sort of see in Australia. He talks, very articulately on things like inflation and government spending and other things. But I question whether he has fully understood the change that has occurred in the United States with respect to
I don't think he has, but Dan, let's put it this way. If you're expecting him to be Trump, you're not going to get that. Will he be better than any sort of right of center leader in Australia, including Howard? I think he probably will be. So on that sense, it depends what you want. Again, I mean, he's not going to deliver. I don't think he'll have a team of people come in and show the incredible waste in the Canadian bureaucracy or things like that. I think he will cut spending. I think he will increase defense spending. I think he will fight some of the culture wars. And again, he's a little bit weak on immigration, but he'll cut it down. He won't cut it down the way Nigel Farage. I mean, he's not going to be as good as Nigel Farage. I think Reform has a really good chance of winning the next British election. So he won't be as good as that. But I mean, he will be better than Stephen Harper, I think, for the kind of views that you and I bring to the table. So he's refreshing. He says what he thinks. You're a little constrained in Canada because the entire bureaucracy will be against you. And Canada has a weaponized judiciary, and they will, in Canada, unlike Australia and the US, even the senior provincial judges are appointed by Ottawa. And so basically, after 11 years of Justin Trudeau, every senior judge in Canada, in the federal courts, in the Ontario Court of Appeal, they're all Liberal appointees. You can't find a left-wing person in Alberta except the judges that Trudeau has appointed. So even Alberta's top judges are all left-wing. So he's going to find that the judges try to block everything he does. He doesn't have to worry about the upper house blocking him because, again, like the House of Lords, I mean, the Canadians federated in 1867, so it was before the sort of democratic movement had completely exploded. And so Canada has an unelected upper house. And one of the things that Conservatives wanted to do is get rid of that. It doesn't really block anything because the problem is, as a body of unelected hacks, how do you actually override the lower house, which is democratically elected? You can't really do it.
Let's talk about that because, you, as I mentioned earlier, you have these frustrations, as I do, about Liberal governments centre-right government get into power in Australia, and they can't actually do anything because the Senate blocks some of their key proposals, and they don't try, or they don't bring it to the election because they know it's not going to get through, and party members grumble and all the rest of it. You're a constitutional law professor. What do you think?
Excuse me. Yes. I'm on a.
What do you think the best way to reform the Australian Senate is? That's a realistic proposal.
So, firstly, we do have the tools to deal with it, but it's a question of incentives. So, I always thought that when Abbott came in, he made a terrible error giving up on repeal of Section 18C. We have a mechanism where you just keep putting bills to the Senate. Let's say there's 8 key proposals you've promised the voters, and you bring the law in and they block it. Don't just do one of them, do 8 of them, and then go to a double dissolution election. And we have a mechanism that the founders put in explicitly so that the lower house, the House of Representatives, is much more democratic. Every constituency, every electorate in Australia has about the same number of voters. There's a little exception with Tasmania. Whereas the Senate is massively disproportionate. As I said, you get the same number of senators in New South Wales as you do in Tasmania. So your vote is worth about 10 times more in Tasmania. And that's because our written constitution effectively copied the American one without a Bill of Rights. So, in the US today, you get 2 senators from California and 2 from Wyoming. California is the most populous state, 38 million. And I think Wyoming's the least populous, although it's soon going to be Vermont. So your vote for senator in Wyoming is worth 76 times more. So the upper house is not nearly as democratic. And the founders in Australia knew that. So unlike the US, they put in this mechanism where if the upper house blocks you, and you have to wait 3 months and there's some criteria, but basically you put it to them again and they block you, you can call a double dissolution election. And that means everybody goes. All of the senators, everyone comes up for election, and you can put those after the election, you can put those exact same bills to the Senate. And if they block them, you go to what's called a joint sitting. It's only happened once with Whitlam. and he got through what he wanted to get through. Oh, actually, it happened twice. Well, Malcolm Turnbull tried it, and he's such an incompetent prime minister that, the double dissolution is based on the premise that because the lower house has twice as many seats, if you win a double dissolution election, you're going to have more. And when you go to the joint sitting, you're going to get your bill through. Somehow Malcolm Turnbull managed to win the 2016 election by one or two MPs, and he lost the upper house by more. So he couldn't even go to a joint sitting. And he went on a ridiculous one bill that was just nobody cared about. So what I would do is I would promise I'm going to do the following 10 things, and I wouldn't care what the Senate, I wouldn't bargain with them. I'd put it to the Senate, all 10 of them. And then I'd wait the 3 months and I'd put it to them again. And if they blocked it, and I would alert people. And then I would go to a double dissolution election and I would say, this is our one chance. It doesn't matter what the Senate does. We will have this joint dissolution election. And if they block it again, all 10 bills will go to a joint sitting and we will pass every single one of these. And maybe while we're at it, we'll pass a voting reform for the Senate, because they're not going to like that. If they're really being difficult, we'll pass voting reform so we don't have to deal with the Jackie Lambys who have, one of the differences between the US and Australia is because they have only 2 senators per state, and because they have first past the post voting, there's only 2 parties. So if you're in Georgia and you're really annoyed at the Senate, you can pick between the Democrats and the Republicans. If there's somebody in Wyoming who's bugging you in the Senate, you have recourse in Georgia. But in Australia, because of our bizarre STV voting system, which is basically creates unaccountable senators, if I don't like what Jackie Lambie's doing from Tasmania, I can't do anything about it. In the US system, she'd be a Democrat, and so I could vote for the Republican. But, you get these independents coming in, and I'm not against independents given the voting system we have. I just don't like the voting system. And so there's just nothing a voter in New South Wales or Queensland can do in terms of dealing with, the Teals or whoever you don't like who gets in the Senate. So we have real, our voting system. I came here thinking preferential voting was okay. There's only, I think, 2 countries in the world that have preferential voting where you rank your votes. It effectively creates a protection racket for the 2 main parties. That is one of the biggest problems in Australia. So I hated what Malcolm Turnbull did to the Liberal Party. And I used to say in The Spectator, the only way you can actually show that you're angry is to preference Labor. Because I got so many people who said, oh, we're really mad with the Liberals. We're going to vote. We're not going to vote for them. And I said, okay, so where did you put the Liberals? And they went 4th. I said, where did you put Labor? 5th. I said, well, you vote for the Liberals. Do you understand? There is no way not to. You are forced to pick between the Liberals and Labor. And if you pick Liberals at 7th and Labor at 8th, you have voted for the Liberals. And the Liberal Party knows that. They know that no matter how dissatisfied with them you are, and that's why I said the only way to punish them is actually to bite the bullet. And it wasn't so bad. Shorten versus Turnbull, there wasn't that big a difference. So I put Greens bottom, Liberals second bottom, Labor third bottom, and then just randomly filled them in. And it would have been better for Australia if Turnbull had lost in 2016. In the same way that, and I didn't see this coming, and I was really upset that Trump lost in 2020, but it's pretty clear now that it's a good thing he lost in 2020 because he's come back in 2024. He would not have taken on the bureaucracy in 2020. He would not have pulled out, he's taken on the international elites and he's taken on the bureaucracy. He's doing things, Trump, that he would not have done if he'd won in 2020. So in a way, with the benefit of hindsight, it's a good thing he lost in 2020. And that was my argument in Australia. It would have been better in the long run to have Turnbull thrown out and expose all of the, the so-called moderate bedwetters in the Liberal Party, the Simon Birminghams and the George Brandis types, and maybe we could have got the party back on the right. So it was a bad thing he won by 1 seat, and he didn't really do anything that any of us want anyway. And I have the same view about Scott Morrison. He promised not to sign up to net zero, and he did it. And through the entirety of COVID, he was basically a thug. Biggest inroads on our civil liberties in 250 years, brought to you by a supposedly right-of-center government. Thank you very much. So I like Dutton way better than Morrison, but Dutton's been a pretty big disappointment. I thought he'd be better.
Yeah. there are big issues that have arisen in the last sort of 5 years in center-right politics in the Western democracies that certainly weren't at the forefront or discussed as much. In preparation for this, I actually went back and had a look at a 2016 book you edited, I think, called "Making Australia Right." And
I thought that was a good title. My title.
Lots of worthy contributions, a lot of people I know, and all the rest of it. But it's interesting that in that 2016 book, there's no discussion of immigration.
I mean, it was bad then, but it's been weaponized since then. I mean, you look at how many people Trudeau has let in since 2015. The massive numbers of people coming into Britain were all pretty much allowed in by a Tory party. I mean, you can't blame Keir Starmer for that. You have to blame David Cameron, Theresa May. You can't really blame Liz Truss. She was only in office for a couple of days. Boris Johnson. And so one of the things that's become clear, and Biden, how many illegals came? Forget legal immigration. I think Biden in 4 years let in somewhere between 12 and 15 million illegals. So it was bad then, but it sort of fell under the aegis of dissatisfaction with multiculturalism, which in 2016 was bad, but it wasn't as bad as now. And so one of the things, I agree with you, I would say that's the single biggest issue. People do not want to articulate the truth that not all cultures are equal. And so you can see this from the data. When you look at, say, immigrants from India who are Hindu, they have some of the best. So in the US, they are the top performing group. They're ahead of Chinese, they're ahead of whites. Almost none of them are on welfare. They have the highest income as a group, per person. Who wouldn't want those immigrants? Or Vietnamese, who wouldn't want those immigrants? Other immigrant groups, and it's partly a function of culture, it's partly a function of religion, massively disproportionately on welfare, committing crimes. And you have no obligation as a country to allow in people who won't assimilate and who bring, it used to be that all the economists would tell you, if you let in immigrants, gross domestic product goes up. Well, gross domestic product goes up, but gross domestic product per person can go down, and it has gone down. And that's why we've had, 7 quarters in Australia where per person GDP goes down, and nobody talks about it. If you live on an island with 20 people and you let 100 people in, by definition, GDP has to go up, because all that term means is you're measuring economic activity. It has to go up. But as an individual, what you care about, how is my individual wealth? And the problem with mass immigration is, even if you don't talk about all the infrastructure problems and all the traffic and all the lack of housing, your actual individual wealth can go down. If you're bringing in, Elon Musk type engineers, of course, those people are bringing up individual GDP. But when you're bringing in, people with a primary school education from the third world, well, here's the blunt truth. They're not bringing up GDP. And we're now seeing this around the Western world, and people are realizing even the stuff that the economists told us basically was misleading and close to, a lie. And so even on the economic terms, and then you add in all the infrastructure problems, the housing problems, and then you add in, Sweden had one of the lowest rape rates in Europe. And then after, the next year, after 1 million people were let in, it's one of the highest. And, what is causing that? And it would be okay, I suppose, if we ran the old-fashioned assimilation programs where immigrants were expected to learn English. They were expected to leave behind all of the sort of cultural hatreds they brought with them. I mean, who can look at multiculturalism in Canada or Australia and think, what have we done for the poor Jewish citizens in this country? I mean, who would ever have thought that the disgraceful things that are being done to Jewish citizens would happen? It never would have crossed anyone's mind. And it's overwhelmingly related to two things: the hard left capture of the universities and, the sort of prejudice some people are bringing with them from the Muslim world. And so, I mean, let's be honest, that's and so, I mean, it's just awful what's happened to Jewish citizens in Canada, here in Britain. It's not a big problem in the US, to be honest, much less of a problem.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in many ways, you're right. I mean, I felt when Trump won in November that, this might be the salvation of Western civilization in the long run, because the Americans, he was set on turning things around, and no one else was going to do that. So he's sort of done that. And so, there might be some costs in terms of tariffs, but I don't really care. I'm much more worried about the sort of things that you're worried about, and long term, I think he's fixing those.
Yeah, I mean, what do you disagree on that form part of the Trump agenda? I mean, trade, you're still free trader. Immigration,
I'm a free trader, but with this qualification, I mean, I never would have let China in the WTO. China cheats; they manipulate their currency. And Bill Clinton, and I don't know who was in office in the early '90s. It might have been, I don't know, whoever it was, but basically Bill Clinton let China into the WTO, and that was a terrible error, terrible, and hard to get them out. I mean, let's be blunt. It would have been better to let Russia into the WTO. They never let Russia in, but they let China in. How ironic is that? And so, they're a sort of hardline communist Politburo that manipulates their currency. And there are other ways to manipulate trade balances other than tariffs, and the Chinese do it. So I don't have any problem with tariffs on China at all. I think, Trump's right that when it comes to Canada, some of the fentanyl is coming through Canada, and some of the border is porous. But compared to Mexico, it's like 20 times more of a problem. So I don't understand why he put the same tariff on Canada as he did on Mexico. I think it partly was just anger at Justin Trudeau, which, and so I think Canada runs a trade surplus, a big one with the US, but it's all based on cheap oil that's sold at below world market prices. So why would Trump care about that? What he's actually forcing Canada to do is to, even the lefties want to build pipelines to the ocean, and they will sell it to someone else, and that'll take 5 or 10 years, and probably good for Canada, not obviously good for the US, but what do they care? They're energy self-sufficient. So, some of Trump is a little off, but it's so little. I mean, if you have a politician who's delivering 90 to 95% of what you want, it seems very weird to me to say, well, I don't like what he's doing in the other 5%. No one can honestly believe that in a democracy you will get 100% of what you want. Only Robert Mugabe got 100% of what he wanted. You're a dictator at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like, and I find this a lot. People use the term classical liberal and conservative a little bit interchangeably in the modern world.
Yeah, I don't.
Because they are distinct. Gladstone and Disraeli represented different intellectual traditions. And
that's true. But if you took Gladstone today, he would be a conservative on all the things we care about, and so would Disraeli, and so would Mill.
It's absolutely. But I feel like, and this is what some of the NatCon other people say, is that in today's politics, certainly still in the Anglo-Commonwealth, the centre-right parties claim that they're the classical liberal party, and getting their roots is like cutting taxation and all the rest of small government, which are all kind of good things. But there isn't really.
But they never do it, Dan. Let's be honest. They say they never ever do it.
But the conservative political tradition isn't as represented, which is much more skeptical of trade, is much more focused on preserving the traditions and culture and people to the next generation, rather than simply creating a nation as a bundle of liberal axioms. And it also is much more skeptical of remaking the world for democracy and interventions left, right, and center.
The foreign policy stuff doesn't really link to. Whether you believe you can go into the sort of Middle East world and remake these countries into Western democracies or not doesn't translate to where you are domestically on the political spectrum. And in fact, you're basically crazy if you think you can do that. But so I suppose there's two things. Firstly, if you actually were a party that cared only about smaller government and, increasing the overall wealth to divide up, I think personally there's a lot of other things that matter more to me, but at least I would respect you for doing that. But the parties who claim that, like Scott Morrison, then go in and increase taxes on superannuation. And they increased taxes, and 13 years of Tory government claiming to be classical liberals, and they delivered the highest tax rate since 1945. So the first thing is they say that, but it's a lie. I'd have some respect for them if they actually did it. The second thing is, you're right. People don't just vote based on how much money is going to be in their wallet. And if you think people are just a function of the struggle for resources, then you're basically a Marxist. I mean, that's the Marxist worldview, that the only thing that matters is, effectively, you can dress it up with all sorts of Marxist jargon, but it's just false. I would sacrifice a fair bit of personal income to have a strong defense, because I'm a Hobbesian, Thomas Hobbes. In a way, we live in this world, which is a very dangerous world, and not spending any money on defense. I mean, it's pretty clear from history, this is suicidal. And I hate what Australia does. We can't even build a ship, and we buy submarines that are going to be delivered. So I would bump defense spending up to 3 or 4%, which is what Trump wants Europeans to do. And it's what Americans do. They spend a lot on defense. And so I don't care how inefficient, and because I worry about the world and defense, I would make sure that national security, so I would protect industries that deliver it on national security, even if they're inefficient compared to importing it from China. I don't care. You can't trust the Chinese when things get bad. So that's one place I would also cut out areas of immigration. I mean, even if it's not true, but even if it turned out that the people pouring over the border or were letting in legally delivered a higher gross domestic product per capita, they don't. But even if they did, I would worry about the cultural stuff. I would not want to move to a country where, the rape rate, like Britain, like Sweden, like all sorts of Europe, just basically goes through the roof. I wouldn't do it, even if I am wealthier. Now, amongst countries with the same sort of outlook, I don't like tariffs. I don't think Trump's tariff on Canada makes too much sense. Sure, if he was just doing it to try to get them to have a border czar, which isn't going to do anything. So, I don't think it's very sensible. And to some extent, Trump has undercut Poilievre, and surely he wants Poilievre to win. So, if you're talking about trade with countries at the same sort of level, then, comparative advantage tells you that you're wealthier. You just are wealthier with trade. If you're talking about countries that manipulate their currency and all sorts of things, then, I agree with you. But that's for me, that's a minor consideration.
Isn't there an issue, though, with Canada and the United States? Because if the United States puts tariffs on China or the rest of the world, as they're proposing to, like a broad-based tariff, you potentially send goods to Vancouver, and even with the best rules of origin and whatever regime in the world, stuff will, if you've got no tariff border between Canada and the United States, that's a backdoor way of sending.
Yeah, that is. But as you said, the WTO rules that try to stop that in Canada, I wouldn't have a problem if Trump said, well, we're ruthlessly enforcing state of origin rules, unless you can prove that there actually is no, I don't think Canadians would object to that. If Trump said, look, you're being too lax on goods coming in from China and I'm going to be ruthless, I don't think that would have triggered the backlash. I mean, I think Poilievre's going to win, but it would, in a way, Trump would be shooting himself in the foot if he arranges a world where he helps the left-wing Liberal Party get reelected. I don't think they will. Yeah, I don't want that, and I'm not sure what he's trying to do. I mean, Canada is completely vulnerable to the U.S., but they're also, people have this veneer in Canada of not liking the Americans, but they love the Americans. I mean, they watch American sports. Australia watches British sports. In Canada, it's all American sports, and everyone goes to Florida in the winter, what they want. So the flow back and forth is very high. And again, Trump does not want to make Canada the 51st state because they're all to the left of Hawaii and California, and basically it would make the Republicans unelectable. It's laughable to think that he really wants that. He's just winding Canadians up, and I don't even mind that. The tariff, I mean, if he put a 3 times higher tariff on Mexico than Canada, I could sort of understand that. It's just laughable to think that Canada and Mexico are the same, on the same level in terms of letting in illegal immigrants or fentanyl or anything else. They're not even close to the same. And I think Canadians feel that that's pretty unfair, and they're right.
No, it's almost like
again, in the grander scheme of things, I don't care.
Yeah, no, I understand. The issue I think is that, which he has alluded to, is that you either adopt the same trade policies with respect to China, so you force Canada to have the same policies with respect to China. But if you don't, then you have to impose tariffs on the border to if that's the policy you want to adopt in the United States. They're the kind of, that's the Lego blocks that need to be kind of arranged.
I mean, again, coming back to actually facts on the ground, almost everything Canada exports to the U.S. is a raw material. So, I mean, it doesn't really matter what China's. The one area where there's a lot of intertwining is the car industry.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
the car industry. And China's not really doing anything on that front. I mean, a North American car made by Ford or GM, leave aside the idiotic electric ones, some of those vehicles will go back and forth across the border 6 times before the car's done. They'll do the base, it goes to Canada, and it's so efficient going back and forth across the border. And in no world does Trump want to upset that. And I don't even know how you'd unwind it. So again, Canada's it's a bit unfair what they're doing to Canada.
One area that the left have been very effective in is lawfare. Do you think the center right utilizes lawfare as much as they could to potentially get actions that their results that they're in favor of, or you just think the cards are stacked in a way?
I've been banging about this forever. I mean, they can't. So here's what people need to know: if you go back 60 years, 70 years, the median voter in Canada, in Britain, in Australia, in the US, the median voter was more politically left-wing than the median lawyer or the lawyerly caste. Take the median. Lawyers were conservatives. Today, the median voter in all those countries is much, much, much more politically conservative than the median lawyer. The lawyerly caste is incredibly left-wing. Lawyers, there's data in the US because donations to political parties in the US is public information. So a guy went through every law professor in the US who gave money, and it turns out the ratio of Democrat donors to Republican donors teaching in law schools is something like 36-1. It would be the same in Australia. We saw it with The Voice. I mean, there were 3 professors in Australia, law professors, who were against The Voice. Me, a colleague, Nicaroni, and somebody out in WA. So we have 38 law schools, tons of law professors, and there's only 3. And how many judges came out against The Voice? Ian Callanan, retired. Yeah. There were sitting judges in favor of it. And the Bar Association came out in favor, and the law societies and the state ones. If here's the thing: I criticize the libs because they don't appoint judges who are right of center. But sometimes people call me and say, "We're trying, but there's no one to appoint." Now, I don't think that's right for men. But here's the honest truth: if you're looking and feel you must appoint a woman, it is exceptionally difficult to find a right of center, and I don't mean a Turnbull supporter. I mean someone who's a originalist, interpret the Constitution according to the intended meaning of the drafters. Good luck finding that. And if you think it's bad today, well, the law schools have, a ratio. We're turning out
this. Lou Clegg, but she's Angus Taylor's wife, so I guess that they'd never be able to appoint.
No, she'd be okay. I mean, she's to the left of me, but she'd be okay. But she can't. But I mean, they just don't know who to appoint. Now, they don't try very hard. I don't think. I think they could do better than they. When you look at some of the most radical decisions in the last 6 years, like the Love case, the Labor appointees were in the minority, and it was Edelman, it was Gordon. Here's what the Liberals did. Under Tony Abbott, they appointed the wife of the retiring High Court judge. So the guy retiring, they appoint his wife. This has never happened anywhere in the world before. It's insane.
Daughter.
Wife. The second time they appointed the daughter. Gordon. Michelle. Wife of Ken Hayne. Now, have you ever heard of that anywhere in the world? We need to appoint someone to replace this top judicial appointment, or it could be anyone, CEO. And you know who we're going to appoint? The wife. Now,
Yeah.
I grew up and my dad coached me in a lot of sports. I was pretty good. I played varsity basketball. And whenever my dad coached me, he said, it doesn't matter how good you are, you're playing the least. He just told me that. He said,
Yeah.
because I'm your dad, you can never play more than anyone else. And, I learned later in life, I looked back and I thought he was right. But at the time I hated him for that. But anyway, you realize. And so you could imagine a world where the wife of the retiring person was so exceptionally good, orders of magnitude better than anyone else. You'd say, okay, we're going to break every convention going and we're going to appoint the wife of the guy retiring. But you know what? Michelle Gordon is not. She average at best. And so what were Tony Abbott and who was his chief of staff? Peter Credlin. I like her. But what were they thinking? Were they thinking, hey, this is a good idea? And then you look at their other appointments. Jamie Edelman. They did then appoint the daughter, Gleason. So having appointed as their first woman picked the Libs, the wife, their second Liberal, they picked the daughter of, and I used to joke and say, boy, the next time the Libs get a pick, the cousin's looking pretty good because now we've got the daughter, we got the wife. Who's next? The second cousin? Completely.
Well, then we have, look, there's so many issues, but we have the Human Rights Commission, which is meant to stick up for, free speech and other things. And they sometimes say some things on free speech, but
hardly ever.
On the gender identity stuff, they've been hopeless. They filed an amicus bureau brief.
I've been saying since 2015 we need to shut it down, and the Libs don't have the cojones. Trump would shut it down. So let me make it blunter than you've made it, Dan. At the height of COVID, when we're suffering the biggest inroads on our civil liberties in 200 years, the Human Rights Commission, every single member had been appointed by the Liberals. Every single one, the president, all the commissioners, everyone was a Liberal appointee. They didn't say a single word. They couldn't find anything to criticize about the thuggish police in Victoria, about the state lock, nothing. They couldn't find anything. People being locked in their homes. It was an absolute disgrace. And, you can't blame Labor for that. And again, just as an aside, across the democratic world, including the US, during those horrible, thuggish, brutal lockdowns, there wasn't a single court in the world that used a Bill of Rights to alleviate the lockdowns. Anyone who thinks a Bill of Rights is your savior, I'm talking to you, Ralph Babette, you're out of your mind. What a Bill of Rights does is it transfers power from the elected legislature to the unelected judiciary. And again, the lawyerly caste is considered, and one of the reasons why lawyers and rich people are vote left is 50 years ago, left-wing parties were redistribution of wealth parties. They were sort of Dennis Healy type parties where what they cared about was taking money but on cultural issues and religious issues, they were, they shared everything in common with the right. They were sane. They didn't think you could have an operation and become a woman, right? They were sane. And I have a bit of time. I'm not a redistribution of wealth guy, but I have some time for those people. And I think in a way, I get it. I think they're wrong on efficiency grounds and, creating wealth so you can share it later. But today's liberal or labor left-wing parties across the democratic world, but especially in the Anglosphere, they are not redistribution of wealth, old-fashioned sort of Bob Hawke type parties or Dennis Healy. They are human rights lawyers-led parties like Keir Starmer. They don't care about redistributing wealth. They pretend to. What they care about is progressive culture issues. And that's why...
What has caused that change, do you think?
Well, they've taken over left-wing parties. And we've produced so many. First of all, they've taken over the universities. As I said, if you worry about the lawyerly caste today, what do you think is going to happen when it's a 36-1 or more ratio of left-wing law professors to conservatives? When I retire, I'm not going to be replaced. I am not going to be replaced by anyone remotely. And I used to complain. I used to complain when Abbott was in office. What are you guys doing to fix the universities? We wrote a book on what, people around the world, I got them together. We wrote a book on how to go about fixing universities. And you know what the Libs do? They consult with the vice chancellors. The vice chancellors are the problem. Why would you consult with them? They all hate you. I've been in meetings. They all hate conservatives behind their backs. And when, when Peter Ridd gets fired for nothing, what does the Morrison government do? Zero. Yeah. And what does the Liberal appointed High Court do? Zero. Morrison should have stepped in the way Trump said and said, we're going to cut all funding to James Cook University until he's reappointed. You won't get a penny, nothing. It's a disgrace what you've done. And, they haven't got the ball. It was a disgrace what happened to Peter Ritt. And he was right about the reef. It wasn't just that for free speech and in any sort of sane world, when we're talking about scientific fact, we have to let opinions flourish. He turned out to be right. And again, so I don't trust the libs to do anything on the culture wars. Zero.
Yeah, I mean, there are people that you speak to in the Liberal Party and the rest of it who make all the right sounds about freedom of speech and classical liberalism, and that's one of the things I'm.
Well, who are they, Dan? Who are they making these right sounds?
Well, ex-IPA.
I like Matt Sullivan a lot. He just voted for the hate speech laws.
I know. I don't want to some of these are friends, so I kind of try and give them the benefit of the doubt, but. There are real threats, and effectively, in the name of protecting the Jewish community, they've introduced laws which make.
And I think that's a complete erring, Dan.
Yeah.
If they had enforced the existing laws, they could have stopped the problem flat. Yeah. They won't. And you know what? These new laws, do you think they're going to be used against people threatening Jews, or do you think they're going to be used against sort of conservative white people? I know what I'm betting. When when Abbott brought in that law. They used it against Abbott, so you can't trust the bureaucracy. You cannot trust the whole AG's department is staffed by young lawyers who've come out of law schools where they're teaching social justice. If these liberal MPs honestly believe that these new laws, basically J.D. Vance's speech could have been delivered against Australia. 100%. Everything he said to the Europeans applies to us. It's an absolute disgrace that the Dutton government didn't oppose that. He's still supporting the e-safety commissioner. She wants to block real, true information. She wants to stop a video of an actual Islamic extremist stabbing a Greek Orthodox or whatever bishop he was, Syrian bishop. I can't remember.
I think she wants to take the nurse's video down too. I mean,
if you are Peter Dutton and you can't see the problem with the e-safety commissioner, again, appointed by the Liberals. Every bad bureaucrat, every bad human rights commissioner, they're all appointed by our side. This is something that Douglas Murray says in Britain. He says, leave aside the US, Canada, Britain, New Zealand, Australia. The right side of politics never, ever appoints actual conservatives to anything. You don't need to go through the Senate for that. They can't appoint them to the bench. They can't appoint. Now, the last time we had good appointees to the bench, that was Howard. He put on Hayden, he put on Callanan. They were great judges, great. But, that for many years, I thought the Labour appointees to the High Court were better. Pat Keane, I don't agree with him on a lot of things, massively better than our side is appointing. And I mean, in terms of the interpretive approach he brings, it's more for what we see. So, they can't appoint anybody. They're afraid of the ABC. Look at the appointments that Trump's making. The left is going crazy because he's actually appointing people who have been attacked by the left, and he knows they won't go to water. The single most important factor in any appointment, if you're a conservative, is this person brave? And I agree with John O'Sullivan's law. John O'Sullivan famously said, any institution that is not overtly conservative will over time become left wing. Yeah, and that's true. That's true in today's world. And so you need people who are prepared. There's a couple of top people you could appoint to the High Court who have been attacked relentlessly by the left. Perfect. We know they're brave. We know they'll stand up to them. Put them on the bench.
To finish up, Jim, there's a lot that can be a lot of things to criticize. What cause for hope is there? What in the next couple of years? Paint an optimistic picture of how things in the next 10 years.
Yeah, I was pretty pessimistic until November 5th. I mean, there has been more done for our side of politics in 1 month of the Trump, and to some extent, 2-bit little countries like Canada or Australia, they can try to block free speech, but if a Trump administration is serious, and J.D. Vance sounded pretty serious. He said, if you don't share our values, I do not believe that any Australian government can take on Elon Musk and Twitter when it's backed by Donald Trump. They will not be blocking this. And so in a way, we owe more to free speech in Australia to this sort of not wayward, that's not the right word, but idiosyncratic billionaire who paid double for Twitter. And he's actually opened it up. And that has caused the other social media. Trump wouldn't have won without Musk buying Twitter. Twitter is the freest exchange of ideas. And it's much better than having some two-bit little left-wing civil servant pretending to be a fact checker. Now, I know a lot about constitutional law, and all of the RMIT fact checking on The Voice was false. Because remember, there's two things in life. There's facts and there's opinions. Facts you can actually look at. Opinions, like if I said, which I did during The Voice, if you vote for The Voice, judges in 10 years are going to be even more activist. That's an opinion. You can't fact check that. If someone else says no, they won't, fine, let us argue. And these little two-bit left-wing progressive fact checkers said, oh, Allan's wrong. Based on what? That's what a lot of fact checking is, just left-wing opinions not liking right-wing opinions. Yeah. On facts, you can come to a consensus over time. It was a fact, I think, not a certain fact, but overwhelmingly likely, that the virus came out of the Wuhan lab. And when you think about it, isn't it a pretty good sign that that's true when your first case is 200 yards away from the front door of the only viral lab in all of China that's doing this? And, that was censored, banned, shadow banned, and you were called a racist and everything else if you said that. Well, it turned out that the American intelligence agencies pretty much knew that right away, and they suppressed that.
Well, the great thing is, and the cause for hope that I see, is that guys like Jay Bhattacharya and others who were kicked off Twitter and censored and vilified are now in charge of major.
Yeah, that's all coming through. That's all these supposed conservatives who said, "Oh, I don't like Trump." He sent mean and boorish tweets. I'm prepared to pay that cost to see the kind of results we're seeing. And the old-fashioned get on my high horse, get on my sort of bogus dignity and pretend that what we need right now in the world on our side is bravery. And you buy people wholesale, not retail. Is Trump a nice person? Well, a lot of people say yes, but in some ways he's crass, he's boorish. But I don't care. I don't really care. If he delivers what he's delivering, look at this. He set out a list of promises and he's actually doing them. Tony Abbott, whom I really like and think was probably the best liberal MP since going back to Howard, or liberal PM since Howard, he promised us up and down that he would do Section 18C. And he couldn't even put it to Senate. He went to water on Senate. He couldn't even say to his party room, we're doing this. If it gets blocked in the Senate, so be it. He lost a lot of support. And the first thing Abbott did is he appointed a Greens to something. Again, and he's the best PM, in my view, that the Liberals have produced since Howard. And the later Howard wasn't as good as the early Howard. And so, again, if we have to live with a guy who's so psychotic that he'll stand up to another party trying to put him in prison, trying to bankrupt him, having to withstand 2 assassination attempts, normal people won't do that. And again, you buy people wholesale, not retail. You can't go down and say, I want this aspect, I want that, I want who's likely to be crazy enough to take on the entire U.S. media and bureaucracy? Not too many people.
Not just him, but like the J.D. Vance, Trump is idiosyncratic, but there's a whole team of people that were tested in fire, are really thoughtful guys. And you can tell reading, you're a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, reading these executive orders, they've been thoughtfully and precisely.
Yes, they have. Yes. But you know what, Jan? You know what? If you go back and look when Trump picked Vance, Paul Kelly thought it was awful. All of the great and the good in the U.S., and I'm talking conservatives, they all said, oh, this is a terrible pick. J.D. Vance is a terrible pick. He should have picked Nikki Haley. He should have picked. The thing about Vance was he was picking someone who would carry on his legacy. And to some extent, if you get rid of Trump, Vance might even be better. And so it was an inspired pick. Well, I can't think of another conservative leader in the world who would have withstood all of the, all of the tut-tutting and picked J.D. Vance. So yeah, it's true that Vance has turned out to be a good pick. But remember, almost no one else would have picked the Vance. So you're right. And Vance is a very smart guy. His wife actually is smarter. She clerked with 3 U.S. Supreme Court judges. She's fantastic, and he's fantastic. And right now, I would bet my mortgage on Vance being the president, winning in 2028, barring some worldwide pandemic or something you can't foresee. Here's another thing about Trump: by keeping his promises, in his first term, he never got above 43% approval. Today, as we speak, it's around 56, 57. Amongst men, it's well into the 60s.
Yeah.
And here's a part that gives you hope, Dan. If you ask approval of Trump right now, 65-year-old and over, it's 50-50. Under 30-year-olds, so 18 to 30, Trump's up 12 points. In other words, young people are all on board, more than, so that tells you that when you offer people a vision for the future where you don't have affirmative action and you don't have DEI and you don't make people pretend that somebody who's had an operation and taken a few drugs is actually, despite every cell in their body being either XX or XY, we don't have to pretend that anymore. It turns out they like that. And that gives me a lot of cause for hope, because what happens in the US eventually gets everywhere else. Eventually.
Hey, Jim, I've kept you a while. I like you, I wake up every morning and get a bit of get inspired when I hear what's happened in the United States, and then I turn to the Australian scene and kind of my hopes drop again. But things do turn around, and they can turn around in Canada as well. And there's lots of I got a lot of Canadian friends, and there are a lot of great Canadians. Mark Stein, John Buchan,
Mark Stein is a genius, and he's been terribly treated. Terribly treated.
That is, it's obscene. The court cases, the bloody lawyers,
in the U.S. and in Britain,
in Canada, elsewhere. So, and he's a genius, and I don't know.
And he's brave. He's brave too.
Health issues as well. Yeah, that's right. So look, the hope springs eternal. We will turn around, and always good catching up with you. And
thanks, Dan. And I'm on board with you guys. As I say, if an organization represents 9 out of 10 of your views, that's better than you do with your wife. A lot better. A lot better, to be honest. So no sane person can expect to have a 1-to-1 correlation to what they want and what some organization is going to give them. It's just not. It's not credible.
Yeah, the NatCon stuff I've found it very interesting and quite an interesting, thoughtful perspective, as well as the guys overseas who are on the same page as well. So yeah, definitely worth checking out. And Jim, everyone should enroll in your class and check out your writings in the Spectator and elsewhere as they go forward. Yeah,
I haven't been fired yet, Dan. I have low expectations. Haven't been fired yet.
Take it easy. See you, mate. Bye.
See you later. Yeah.